So I am joined this afternoon by Jed, Grill Country regular, and we have a guest today, Sarah. And Sarah had brought up a question to us about whether there was a connection, like a philosophical connection between the Reformed idea of theonomy and Christian anarchism. So that's kind of what started the conversation. And then we sort of broadened the discussion and decided that what we would do is we would talk more broadly about the question of political authority and Christianity, and um, what is the proper basis of political authority for Christians? What's the proper relationship to the state? And just bring our various perspectives to that. Does anybody have anything they'd like to say at the outset?
Well, I'd like to say that I'm not sure I will contribute a whole lot to this conversation, but in listening to Nate and Jed chat back and forth, I'm eager to hear their perspectives on what that looks like and Christian anarchy in particular. And then I think Jed has kind of a twist on that he's been interested in. And then I'd also really like to hear what these theories or ideas might look like on a practical level, because I think for me, my interest in politics has been pretty well nil to none, because it just doesn't seem to affect my everyday life and how I live. I have 4 kids, we're busy, we're doing things, but at the same time, I feel like I can't ignore the political situation. So yeah, just kind of exploring what that might look like on a very, immediate practical ground level.
Great. So Jed, I know before I would like to hear. I know you do have a kind of a little bit of an interesting you know political, or what shall we say, political slash socioeconomic perspective. You believe that you know the biblical concept of jubilee has something important to give us in this regard, and I've never had a chance to have you develop that in any detail. Um, Whereas
Right.
everyone's heard me expound on my Christian anarchism ad nauseum many times. So I'm more interested in like hearing that first.
Sure. And I haven't, like, even on my channel, I'm still working on kind of organizing material. So probably what I'll talk about here is just, it'll be pretty loose in terms of things that I do want to develop further. I do think so. The Jubilee tradition, right, of cyclical clean slates, debt forgiveness, emancipation of, in the biblical law codes would be out of Leviticus 25. And then also Deuteronomy 15, the regulations change in terms of time frame, right? In Leviticus, you have basically a 49 to 50 year cycle where debts are cleared, specifically private debt, not so much commercial debt, merchant debt, those kinds of things, but private debt between landholders, those kinds of things. That gets cleared. And then, like, I guess you would say, like, Israelite citizens, in a sense, part of that Commonwealth of Israel, are repatriated to their land. So if they have a land inheritance, that land is returned to them within that 50-year window. Slaves are set free. But this is actually a very old tradition that predates even the Bible. What's different about the Bible is that it's prescribed as a cyclical period. Right? In Leviticus, you're getting a 7 Jubilee cycles, which would be 49 years. So 7 years, times 7, you end up at 49 years. The 50th year is the Jubilee. In the book of Deuteronomy, that's a little bit simplified. Those debt forgiveness regulations go in every 7 years, and probably because Deuteronomy is written in a time where population is shifting more from an agrarian society to a urbanized society, right? And so how debt function was a little bit different. But anyway, in the ancient Near East, dating back to basically as soon as we have civilization, we have record of debt forgiveness. And it was and this gets outlined both in David Graeber's book, Debt, A 5,000 Year History, and then Michael Hudson wrote a book on debt forgiveness called And Forgive Them Their Debts, that outlines the history of it from, Neolithic period all the way into modern era. But what they would do, and a lot of times these debts were forgiven in the biblical codes, it's kind of wrapped up in certain ideals of what the kingdom of God is. But what they would do in the ancient Near East, in like Sumeria, Babylonia, these regions, is there's just pragmatic, right? You need to have a city, your city state needs to have the free availability of freeholding labor, right? So if your freeholding farmers basically are encumbered with undue amounts of debt and they can't repay those debts, as a city state, that puts you in a precarious position, right? They can run off to the next city and become your rivals. They won't be able to serve on public works projects when, after harvest has been taken in or in between planting periods, they would either go to war or they would work on public works projects. So they did not want their societies to be over encumbered with debt. And so these periodic debt forgiveness events or clean slates would be proclaimed, not so much altruistically, but just pragmatically. You do not want to lose your population base to debts overextending themselves, because they knew, the Babylonians and Sumerians knew what we also understand very quickly is compounding interest eventually outstrips your ability to repay debts. And so that's kind of the basic, like a thumbnail sketch of why the ancient world did debt forgiveness. And that dynamic begins to fall off in really the biblical period. We have no real record that those jubilees were ever actually practiced. It's in the law code, but we have no record that the Israelite kings were ever instituting these debt forgivenesses. And so that concept of debt forgiveness becomes spiritualized as we get into the writing prophets. So Isaiah 61, which Jesus delivers his first sermon in Nazareth out of Isaiah 61, is really hearkening back to that Jubilee tradition. A lot of Ezekiel's writings are also rooted in that tradition, but kind of echoing the kingdom ideal laid forth in the book of Deuteronomy, that there shall be no poor among you. That's like the ideal of how the kingdom was supposed to work, at least as Israel was conceiving it. And so the idea of liberation from debt also gets tied to concepts of spiritual liberation, and then just setting the ethical framework where a society can function and grow and flourish. Well, it's not unironic that when Jesus delivers his first sermon, he delivers a Jubilee sermon. And really that those are some fundamental ideals undergirding his teaching on what the kingdom is, right? And what's the response in Nazareth is they try to kill him. And if you understand how especially debt plays a role in the structures of power within politics, and you look at what was happening in Palestine during Jesus's time, is you have a society that is being encumbered with exorbitant amounts of debt and taxation through the Roman conquest of the land. And basically what Rome is doing is using its colonial territories to siphon wealth off of. So they were just vacuuming up basically anything that wasn't nailed down. Fishing industry, agriculture. So people who maybe would have been able to make a living 50 years prior to the Roman conquest, all of a sudden imperiled with real poverty because their debt burdens were exorbitantly high and the taxation was exorbitantly high. So when Jesus comes in and he starts declaring that, Isaiah 61, which is a clear reference to the Jubilee tradition, is fulfilled in your hearing, that is like, that's a big no-no to power, right? So if you look at debt history forgiveness, like debt forgiveness type history in especially the Greco-Roman world, if you started advocating debt forgiveness, is a good way to get killed, right? So the Gracchi brothers in Rome, I believe in Athens it was Solon, a few of the kind of populist tyrants that would rise up. That's a lot of times how they would gain popularity, is promising debt forgiveness. Well, it's a real problem for oligarchic power, because that's how they actually maintain and leverage power. So a lot of political power is actually a function of economic power, and it gets leveraged through debt. So in reading especially Hudson's book, and Hudson is he's a Marxist economist. I think he actually comes from a Christian background, but he goes into a lot of detail of how the whole concept of Jubilee gets wrapped up into the concept of Christian apocalypse, and that it was a signifier of this age to come. And so I started playing with the ideas and just like, well, what would a Jubilee-based society look like? And just loosely speaking, like you would need to reinstitute a series of cyclical debt forgiveness cycles. It does a lot of good things. It clears out what's called the crowding out effect economically. At some point, you run out of lendable dollars to be able to put toward productive economic activity because all the money that's in the economy is being used for debt service, right? And we're kind of in that place right now. Usually the way that debts get resettled, international debt gets resettled is one of two ways. It either gets forgiven or you fight a war over it. So a lot of like even what we're seeing going on in Russia, Ukraine, and the tensions with NATO, if you peel back the economic layers, there's a huge debt piece to this that many people are paying attention to. They'll wrap it up in moral rhetoric and all these kinds of things. And we need to also follow the dollars. You know, who is benefiting financially from these kinds of conflicts? And typically what ends up happening is it's major financial institutions. And so a society that has a cyclical debt clearance mechanism, what you're doing is you are addressing the poverty problem. You're addressing certain hierarchical problems as far as how societies stratify themselves, because usually those upper echelons of society are closely linked with finance, whatever the finance mechanisms are within the society. And you're no longer allowing your economic piece of your social political arrangement to run your political piece, because politically speaking, it's the political body itself that has the power to clear debt. And actually in America, that's still the same way. Theoretically, Biden could wipe out student loan debt with just the stroke of a pen, right? So, but they don't do that because our systems of power are so enmeshed in finance that what ends up happening is you have an incredible allocation of wealth kind of at the top of the pyramid. But each layer you go down, you're increasing your suffering, your poverty levels, and those kinds of things. So the idea would be that that you would have a society that runs fundamentally, at least the economic driver would be a jubilee cycle that allows for debt to function properly within an economy. Debt's not bad. Like you want debt to promote economic activity, encourage, adequate risk taking in business ventures, those kinds of things. But what you don't want to do is make debt this kind of sacrosanct, inviolate principle through contract law that can never be wiped out. What's valuable about debt is it establishes an economic relationship that enables economic growth. But what's dangerous about debt is if you don't have a clearance mechanism, it can quickly overtake an entire economy. So we have kind of that situation in our modern economies, over financialized, where a lot of what we're seeing in terms of price inflation, all kinds of things are a function of too much debt in the system. And the easy answer is wipe it away. The only people that really get hurt in those debt clearance events are financial institutions, but they can be made right with, a government that can just reissue currency and allow them to reissue debt, or the government can actually take over those functions. Depending on how somebody wants to model that out. But at the spiritual level, if you read a lot of Jesus's parables in light of that Jubilee tradition, so for example, like the laborers in the vineyard, or the parable of the servant who was forgiven 10,000 talents and these kinds of things, is that debt forgiveness is also, there's a moral and ethical and spiritual component to it. And so this is where I think at a social level, like we probably can't get to a Jubilee society without some sort of spiritual revolution, where if you want to be the kind of person who can live in a Jubilee society, you got to be a forgiving person. You have to be willing to forgive your neighbor. You have to be willing to not be motivated by greed, but understand that economic growth is a part of a flourishing society. However you want to measure growth, by the way, we do have a limited planet with limited resources. So you can't extract resources forever and build your growth on those metrics. But however you want to measure your economic growth and your economic flourishing, there has to be kind of a spiritual, ethical, and moral component to that. And I think that is actually embedded in a lot of what we see in Jesus's teachings and parables. So to put it loosely, I think that as we kind of get further into history, closer to whatever that age to come is, and I'm very apocalyptic in my orientation and thinking, is that whatever that society is going to look like, it's going to run off of that kind of a Jubilee principle. So anyway, I hope that kind of answers at least some question. I'm sure it maybe raises others. So
Few immediate observations. First of all, in that same part of Leviticus where the Jubilee is discussed, there's also in that same passage, there's the establishment of God's ownership of the land and the idea of the Sabbath for the land.
So there's an ecological component to Jubilee.
Yeah, there's an ecological component. Yeah, it's like don't abuse the land. Like give the land a rest. The land needs a Sabbath too, and also like that ultimately the land all belongs to God. So you're using the land, but the land is God's.
Right. Right.
So I would also say that there's something. I mean, it's certainly not a reformed kind of theonomy, but there is some. I mean, in some way, I think all Christians are inevitably going to be somewhat theonomic. Like you can't find a Christian that doesn't want to see God's law.
We have a concept of a kingdom, right?
Right, exactly. So there's a sort of inevitable theonomy that is true to all Christians. In fact, Christian anarchism is ultimately driven by a sense of theonomy. Ironically, I mean that's really what's driving it. It's a complete rejection. It's a complete rejection of the laws of man and adherence only to the laws of God. So that's really what drives Christian anarchism. So that's what, for your initial question, I would say that what the connection is that Christian anarchism is just another, shall we say, an extreme expression of theonomy, and this idea of Jubilee that Jed is talking about also is clearly, I mean, it's drawing its inspiration from, from Scripture and from divine law, like from actually the Leviticus, which is a book of law.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic, because I'm like this, very progressive, hippy dippy kind of guy, but like realistically, like I'm conserving a very real tradition and element and trying to say like we need to retrieve that.
Well, I can't also help but think of the Our Father, because even though we translate it as trespasses in English, like in Greek and Latin, you get the real original sense of what Jesus is talking about, because it's really debts. It's really talking about debt forgiveness, and certainly, like, I mean, one can think of sin as debt. That's fine, and that was
Well, that is actually, Graeber brings that out in his book, right? So a lot of the like you take even most major both Indo-European, and then because he's an anthropologist, so he kind of peels back these layers: Indo-European languages, Semitic languages. Almost all language for debt is religious, right? It has to do with sin. So in German, Schuld, SCHULD is often used as a stand-in for debt. Well, that is a sin and righteousness kind of term where we get should from, right, in our English. And so there is a sense where there is a sacred component to debt.
Right. And ultimately, the primacy of God's ownership is really important here for understanding why this concept of debt forgiveness makes sense. Because when human beings are forgiving others their debts, they're acknowledging the fact that they don't really own anything, that everything belongs to God. This is why people misread how deep Jesus's render under Caesar actually goes, because when Jesus says that, he knows perfectly well that Caesar doesn't own anything. Because God says right there in Leviticus, in this portion you're talking about, that the land belongs to him. So Caesar's only pretending to own it when it really belongs to God.
Right. And I think, like, I mean, I don't want to get into this at this point, just because I don't think that like a Jubilee based, let's say, economic system, I think it can probably accommodate a lot of different political arrangements, whether that's anarchist, communist, monarchist, democratic, any of those kinds of systems. I think that they're compatible with, and we should probably begin to put that into the economic lexicon of our societies, to say, hey, we should, like, I think one of the best ways to avoid like major global conflict is a debt forgiveness event, because that will cool down a lot of the actual economic tensions that are driving some of our conflicts. But I tend to think that like what we'll see is kind of a hybridization of different political theories and arrangements that begin to kind of coalesce very well around a Jubilee cycle that can be anything from like direct democracy to certain communal, like communitarian socialist type arrangements, but still accommodates a kind of certain aspects of a market economy, right? Because debt is basically, it's a function of markets.
Well, markets are just, I mean, there really is no such thing as an anti-market system, because
Yeah, you have
markets
to
are
have a
just,
market economy.
markets are just an inevitable result of human interaction.
Yeah,
It's a social
yeah,
thing that just naturally comes about. Like, you're always going to have markets.
right.
So I think we have a tendency in the liberal West to associate markets with capitalism, but there's no, like, the market has existed long before capitalism, and
Yeah,
if capitalism ever fades, it will exist long after capitalism. It's just a
Yeah.
feature of.
It seems like there's a difference between just a normal buy, sell, trade market versus capitalism as the pursuit of capital for the sake of capital. And
That's right.
right.
like
Yeah, what capitalism is specifically, it's a form of trying to take all morality out of the market. Like,
Right.
specifically does that. So the only thing that is acknowledged is just the pure profit motive. It's intentionally amoral,
Yeah,
and it's enlightened self-interest is supposed to make the whole thing work. Well,
right.
that's definitely not. That's not a Christian economy. It just isn't. There's no biblical defense for the idea that we should just be able to pursue our own economic self-interest and everything will work out okay, and we don't have to pay attention to what God says about how we should conduct ourselves in the marketplace.
Right. It's just like, I think what a Jubilee does is it indexes a, moral and ethical norms within an economy. Right. So let's use like Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis that's going on there as an example. Like, with like exorbitant Wall Street profitability, especially in the last 10 years, or post 2008, where we basically have had this, it's kind of ending now, but we've had this bull run for well over a decade in our economies with largely inflated CEO bonuses and incredible shareholder returns, all these kinds of things. That is happening at the same time that critical infrastructure, social and public infrastructure is crumbling, that is actually creating massive problems for common people's lives. In a Jubilee system, that would not be workable, right? Because you have a certain inviolate principles, especially against poverty, right? Poverty means the system has failed. And so, in a Jubilee system, the ability to allocate appropriate resources to where they're actually needed, because you no longer have inviolable debt agreements through like our financial contracts. Those can be abrogated as needed in order to get resources to where they need to go. And it's not an issue of, you get into questions of personal property and private property and how we render property agreements and those kinds of things. And I'm sure there's probably a lot of ways you could sort that out. But at the end of the day, there's a moral and ethical imperative behind it that says that poverty means that if you have a social and political system that has made peace with poverty, it is a failure. And I think that, like, in terms of like Western capitalism and how that gets bound up within Western Christianity, it shows that we actually really haven't taken Jesus's teachings very seriously. And really haven't taken our own biblical legacy very seriously. So, there is like, obviously I'm not a theonomist, Sarah, like coming out of a Reformed background. And even when I was Reformed, I was not a part of that school of thought.
Right.
It's like, I think that they skip.
But yeah, Jed, you really are a theonomist at the same time.
It's
a dispute not about whether God's law should be followed or implemented, but it's a dispute about what God's law is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and like you get into like Paul's discussions on the law and where like real righteousness actually comes from. You realize it comes from apart from law, So I there's a real antinomian streak within me as well.
Right.
But
But that's still, but even that is still like, that comes out of like just recognizing the absolute sufficiency and primacy of the law of love.
mm,
It's still, so,
yeah, and
which is what Christian anarchism comes out of too.
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
that, because out of that naturally flows the principle of non-coercion.
yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I mean,
and I think that that's where so my understanding of like the kind of the Reformed theonomists that I used to have, like, hour-long debates online once upon a time. I spent my time very wisely back in the day. But
Online debating is good for that.
yeah, oh, those are hours I will never get back. But they see a much more expansive application of biblical law. They want to see the Decalogue and certain aspects of moral, civil, ceremonial law reinscribed as the kind of the legal basis of the society. Well, a couple problems I have with that. A, it's kind of already the case in the West. Like our legal tradition is definitely inflected by biblical norms. Whether we do it well or not, that's a different question. But it's like we're kind of already there in a lot of respects. But B, what I see the problem with is this kind of this naive idolizing of a concept of biblical morality that never existed historically and would probably end up being quite oppressive if it ever was implemented at scale in a contemporary setting. Right. And you see those in kind of small closed communities where it's typically heavily patriarchal, and how those, how the law gets enforced tends to be fairly uneven in terms of who's bearing the brunt of being viewed as lawbreakers. Right.
Right. And that's where it seems to fall apart for me, because it's like, who decides what is implemented and to what degree? It's like, are we stoning adulterers, or how far do we go down the road? But I know it's also difficult because we all live in this society that we live in. So I would like to hear a little bit from both of you how your views change how you interact with politics, with society, just on a personal level. Because it's easy to slap a label on yourself, but if you're, I feel like, it should change how you interact with those things to a certain degree, or at least how would you see that affecting your own personal choices, decisions about how to interact in this, American culture. That's
a great question. Do you want to go first, or?
Sure, I guess. So it definitely has. As I've come to like a clear understanding and developing like these Jubilee concepts, it has made me more aware of, at this point, where real social change takes place, is much more at the community level and at an interpersonal level, and those big structural questions of who to vote for and what party is in office and those kinds of things. To me, at this point, there's so much toxic inertia in our political system that I find it hard to be an active participant, at least in electoral politics. So I didn't vote in this last election. I didn't see a candidate that I was comfortable casting a ballot for, one way or the other. I felt like it would be contributing to the delinquency of a republic by casting a vote for either of them. So, like, in a sense, what it does for me is I'm not kidding with this either. Like, my hope and ambition and aspiration is to see the kingdom realized. And I realize that for me, the way that looks is like much more at the personal level of how that's embodied. And trying to also, be as active as I'm able, even with the limited resources I have, in caring for the poor. And then actually understanding that in order to get to that kingdom reality, like it really does take a large scale spiritual revolution, which of course I can't instigate that, but I can be a part of that in my interactions with people. And so it's simplified in a sense, like, trying to speak to issues. So even in the workplace, like I'm kind of middle management for a home improvement company, and realizing kind of the contradictions and brutalities of a capitalist system makes it very difficult on employees. So my aim is to make sure that their jobs are A, secure, and B, that it's enhancing their ability to live their lives outside of work. Right. And so making sure that they're treated well, with respect, with all the values that really we pick up from Christ's teachings. Now, I'm not out actively evangelizing my employees, but I do want to make sure that what they are experiencing from me is a real embodiment of God's generosity toward me. And so that is something I try to do. And beyond that, I don't have like a big how to take over the world kind of manifesto that I'm working on or anything like that. It's just
so disappointing.
Maybe I need to do some more homework, right, Sarah? But in a sense, like for me, it's like it's always going to boil down to the personal stuff, because at the big structural level, I'm not in a position where I can affect change at that level. Mm-hmm. And so I don't really worry too much about that.
Right.
For me, it's about it. It's a lot of it is aspirational, because at the end of the day, like Christian anarchist principles are simply kingdom principles.
Right.
And so aspiring to see those principles implemented in your own life, and to as much a degree as possible within communities, just keeps us focused on what those kingdom principles are. And that would be, as I alluded to earlier, that would be the primacy of the law of love, a love which extends all the way up to and including your enemies, and takes seriously. It doesn't think that Jesus was kidding when he said resist not evil, and does not believe in resisting evil by force, and believe in and adheres to a principle of non-coercion. So in terms of what that means practically for me, it means that I mostly don't vote. Now, to be fair, I was a neocon for a good portion of my adult life. I went when I started at Evergreen as a freshman, right out of high school. I was progressive, liberal type. My experience at Evergreen quickly, I'm kind of a contrarian by nature.
Really, Nate?
Yeah, really. I know that's really shocking. I'm kind of a contrarian. So my experience at Evergreen resulted in me immediately shifting radically to the right. I always had some underlying, I read at that time, I'd read Jacques Ellul's Anarchy and Christianity. And I had an anarchist reading of a lot of key biblical texts. I read 1 Samuel in an anarchist way. I noticed that Romans 12, which exhorts to pray for your enemies, comes directly before Romans 13. So my natural reading of a lot of the biblical texts leaned in a Christian anarchist direction. But my pragmatic streak made me lead toward a sort of libertarian, a right libertarian kind of political view, which put me, and I was a bit of a hawk, and I was not a pacifist. I thought pacifism, again, maybe it's inspirational, but it's not practical. That pragmatic streak led me to be a neocon. And then gradually I just had to set all those things aside. And those things were always kind of in the back of my mind. And the more I read theology and the more I read the Bible, the more I realized that I was being ridiculously inconsistent, and out of a sense of pragmatism holding these positions. And in fact, I've since come to seeing pragmatism as actually kind of a subtly diabolical way of looking at the world. Mm-hmm. Because that's not how we're called to look at the world as Christians. Mm-hmm. We're called to a deeper way of looking at the world than a mere pragmatism. Mm-hmm. So again, like I said, I don't vote. Now that doesn't, but there are contradictions that I will fully acknowledge. I work for state government. I work in public disclosure, which is kind of like an area of state government that may be a little bit easier for an anarchist to stomach, because public disclosure is is the part of government that like is responsible for making sure that government is accountable to the people. So so that it can't hide its operations from the governed. So there is that. And that just comes I need to feed my family. And what am I going to say? So yeah, even though I'm a Christian anarchist, I work in state government. And I was, I thought what he was saying was significantly different from most of what I hear in American politics, that I did actually fly to Iowa to knock doors for Andrew Yang. So I actually got involved in politics. And I had some company. Wendell Berry has often been described as a Christian anarchist and also supported Yang. So sometimes you have to make room for some sort of gradualism when things are as bad as they are.
And I was, by the way, I was active in Bernie's campaign.
Yeah.
But that, that was like the McGovern dream as well. It died quickly.
Yeah.
So I found myself
well, we get along, but the Bernie folks in Iowa didn't really like us so well. In fact, there was a point where a group of Bernie supporters drove by us in a car and yelled "F Yang" out at us.
I can't say that it wasn't me.
Oh.
So Sarah, I have a question for you then. Like in terms of, like, just in kind of bringing up the topic, and kind of also, you're a mom of 4 kids, very busy in all these kinds of things. Like, why is the concept like something that is of interest to you? Like, in terms of, is it that you are raising kids that you're putting out into the world and are concerned about what they're going to grow up into, or like what is it that is like an animating factor in just your interest in the topic?
Yeah, it's been an interesting, well, it mostly has to do with my relationship with my husband and my family. I grew up in a family that was very concerned with politics, and as a 9-year-old, I was pacing the yard when Bill Clinton was elected, and listening to Rush Limbaugh, and it was always this fear of the Democrats, and so it's always. And then my husband was a lot more active in following politics and concerned about those things than even he is in the past few years. So we've kind of been on a journey. I for one just threw up my hands and said, I don't see any of this going anywhere. Why waste my time dealing with politics? Like, I'm just going to focus on the here and now, my small community, my family, and that's all that I just kind of said, that's all that matters. But then I have other family members, close family members, who are like, well, what about the corruption? Who's going to change things? And we're all living in this society. So it's more been a wrestling with how involved should a Christian be, and I understand that could be a person to person thing. Like, maybe I'm not called to do that, maybe someone else is, but then just trying to figure out, even on a like, for instance, you mentioned, Nate, taking care of the land. We have a huge amount of land in our possession. And so even within the past couple of years, like, we've really been thinking through, what does that mean? What are changes that we could make that would actually move us towards that kingdom perspective, while at the same time not throwing out the heritage that we've been given with the land. And if we don't hold it, Bill Gates is probably going to come in and buy it all. So right. It's just trying to figure out what that balance is, and how much do we let go? How much do we hold on to try and transform? Is that even possible? And then how do I inform my kids? Like, what's the example that I'm setting for them as far as their involvement in these things? It really, to me, it always comes back to the immediate and the local community is going to be more important. And I think that's what we have been trying to base our decisions on locally. Like, we're able to actually provide more people with jobs and have more people come back to the community. And I've seen people's, we we've gotten to interact with different people and develop relationships with people through our business, and through the farm, which a lot of people would say is, you know, what we do is, I mean, on a philosophical level, I struggle with almost despising it sometimes. And again, like you, Nate, working for the state government, I kind of feel like there's this balance of, you know, how do we enter into the structures that we've been given, and then hopefully to whatever degree transform them from the inside out.
Mm-hmm.
That focus on the local and community is really healthy, I think. And I think that's, I mean, from my perspective as a Christian anarchist, it's like Christian anarchists still believe that you got to have communities, right? So it's not like, so, and so I think that's really important, because I think the problem is we have a tendency to view the state as if it had a monopoly on human cooperation, but it doesn't.
Right.
So if ultimately we are responsible for building the communities that we want to see. And I'm not saying that I live up to that. That's why I say a lot of it is aspirational, right? It's reminding me of, like, these are the standards that I should be striving in as much as I can. And I'm always looking for opportunities to do so. But those opportunities are what they are. And I as much as I have opportunity to create those opportunities, I also do so. So I think that's fantastic. I mean, that's right there, because that's more in your control. And it's our culture is in a pretty bad state because the state has really, like, leveled all of the kind of intermediary institutions and community structures that used to kind of be layers in between the individual and the state. So now it's like that's much less the case. And it's almost as if, like, the family is like the last intermediary institution that it hasn't totally eliminated, and it's not clear to me that it doesn't have designs on it.
Well, I think that part of, like, one of the biggest tensions in our time is that we're running up against the limits of the modern nation state as a viable means of arranging societies, right? We have tremendous pressures that are just natural pressures against kind of a national arrangement.
It's almost anachronistic at this point, to be honest with you. Like, me as a Christian anarchist talking about the state, I mean, the state is almost a dead letter. We've actually surpassed that now, where the states are largely, at least within the Western liberal order, the states are all in a position where they're subservient to something that is beyond the state.
And that's where the Jubilee concept comes in, because realistically, like, at this point in, like, American politics, which I'm most familiar with, it's the tail wagging the dog. It's the economic and financial component of our society that is driving the politics and is actually dictating policy.
Right.
And oftentimes those are in the interests of those who have the resources and have the power. And so what ends up happening is, well, yeah, when like, maybe we had that golden post World War II era where there was reasonable alignment between a large and growing middle class and the social and political and economic elite in terms of a broad consensus on how the pie got divided up, right? And so we were able to have some years of incredible stability and growth, but we've kind of run against the limits of that now, where what has ended up happening is really the state is a fig leaf for financial interests. And to me, that is a big concern, and
controlled by them, and not just here, pretty much like across the entire Western liberal order. That's the norm.
And realistically, I mean, it controls policy outside of the liberal order in a lot of ways. It dictates policy. I mean, a lot of our conflicts and wars are being fought over who has control over critical resources. That's really what's underneath a lot of the conflicts we're seeing in the world today is, having control over strategic choke points where resources are either being produced or where they're flowing through, whether that's the Horn of Africa, some of the issues going on in the Arabian Peninsula, Ukraine. These are all in terms of either shipping lanes or access to oil, or Ukraine being like basically one of the most important agricultural regions on the planet, and Russia as well. I mean, I'm sure you probably know this better than I do, Sarah, but like I was reading some articles on like the escalation of just a lot of the fertilizers globally are produced out of Russia and Ukraine. And so you have skyrocketing prices, you're having a huge commodity crunch, all these kinds of things. Well, that's what's kind of driving a lot of this. That's the hidden part of these conflicts. We're going to go, we'll hear about the moral component, which I have no problem touching on that. But a lot of what is driving this is who has control over what.
Yep.
And part of my problem is that it really leaves, even in a democratic society, it leaves the general population without any recourse or real say in their own political destiny, because it doesn't matter what we vote for, who we vote for, what policies we advocate for. Ultimately, we don't have any say in what legislation gets passed, what even reaches the floor, what kind of policies get enacted. And a lot of times it's not in the interests of our population. And I'm somebody who, like, as a general rule, I'm totally fine with globalism. I think it's been on the whole, like, it's actually a net positive, but it just creates a lot of tensions when you have a political arrangement where the nation state is seen as like this kind of inviolate political principle.
I'm not okay with it because it's still based on that same immoral idea. Where you take all the morality out of the market. So it can't, there's no such thing as moral neutrality.
No, it's like,
moral neutrality is just a myth.
Yeah, and I don't think and like I said, like, I don't think there's any way that we do, like, in a sense, even as kind of locally minded people. And I think we're probably all in that boat, like, where it's like, at least I know, like, I can affect change, whether that's in my workplace, in my home, in my friendships, in my community. I can do meaningful things, but at the global scale, it just feels like it seems very beyond me. But I do know that, like, there is an opportunity for people to kind of rise up and be heard, to say that, no, we're not consenting to this. This is not the world this isn't the world I want my kids to have to grow up in. Where, the prospect of them going to a four-year college entails taking on massive amounts of debt that's going to put them behind the eight ball before they ever really enter into their careers. I don't like that. Like, now, I'm not saying that, like, the Bernie Sanders solution is the one and only way to approach that problem, but we got a problem, and it needs a real solution, because, like, I taught for 5 years in Southern California, like in a low income, minority dominated district. And what I can tell you is the level of despair that young people have for their future is palpable. They are not optimistic. I think very different than like what we grew up in. In my early 40s, growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was a sense where our lives were going to be better than our parents. Yeah. I don't think that we can offer those same kind of promises to our kids. And I know that, like, young people definitely, and so a lot of, like, even the major unrest and the political iconoclasm and people tearing down statues and memorials is they just don't believe that this system in the American dream can deliver for them anymore. They don't believe in it.
Do you think that's impacting, to a certain degree at least, the fact that these younger generations seem to be disinterested in having children?
Yeah, I mean, it's really strange. I mean, I have a few friends in their 20s, and it's like, no, I feel like it would be morally irresponsible to have children. And it's a shocking conversation to somebody who's a parent and understands how much that can enrich your life.
So we could literally end up in a situation where the misery created by the system that we have that feeds the greed of certain classes of people could actually end up leading to the extinction of our species. Mm-hmm. Because by just putting them in such a situation of despair.
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing birth rates collapse, all over the place. And that's, I mean, in terms of like an economic indicator, that's a red flag for any political body. If you're starting to see plummeting birth rates, you are in for trouble.
Right. Well, I mean, it's not globally, the situation's probably okay. I mean, like, the situation doesn't look good for, like, say, Western democracies or China, actually, which has a
really big problem.
Yes, this is why Nigeria is projected to be more populous than China by 2050. because Nigeria has like a fertility rate of 6.91, and China is below replacement level.
Yeah.
Well, I also think too that the tale of the American dream that was, you know, individual success has also seen its limits. And I think people who bought into the idea that having lots of stuff, and we're obviously seeing that kind of come to an end, while losing the bonds of community and the, you know, the local family structures, it would lead you to nihilism, no matter how successful, quote unquote, you are. And so that's been our focus as well, is how do we kind of rebuild that small town culture where people want to move back and form those bonds again, where families can raise their kids with each other and run down the street to their aunt and uncle's house. I mean, my husband's sister and her husband have been in the military, in the Navy for quite a few years now, and they're moving back to the farm with us, you know, because they see the potential of that. And yeah, so it's interesting.
Right. And that's what I was saying, Sarah, is that like we really do. I mean, it is within our power to build the communities that we want, regardless of what the state can be, whatever it is. You know, the global economic situation can be whatever it is, but we still have the ability to create the communities we want. And you don't need to be rich to do it. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Because it has nothing to do with wealth or poverty.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I'm working on a little talk, because I mean, Sarah, I mean, I don't know what kind of material you've interacted with that I've put out, but I'm very apocalyptic in my outlook, right? I think that we are right up against one of the most major inflection points in human history. Now, people do not have to share that opinion or perspective, but it is definitely animates a lot of my sense of things. And, you know, I see that kind of manifesting itself in a lot of very dark ways, like the prepper mentality or buying guns and ammo. And like realistically, like how you survive the apocalypse is by building communities of mutual support, people you can rely on, people that know your name and know that, you know, if they need to come next door for flour, sugar, or eggs, or whatever it is, that if you've got it, you're going to help out. And likewise, you know, you could go knock on their door. And to build those kind of resilient communities that can come around and help each other where help needs to happen. And that is, like Nate said, that is not because, you know, you do not have to be wealthy to do that. It doesn't require that. So I think like that there is an element of like, in a sense, it's an act of, you know, heroic defiance in light of kind of a crumbling social order to say, no, even in the middle of a world that seems like it's kind of crumbling and falling apart around us, I can't change that. You know, and I feel fairly powerless myself in light of that. But what I can do is make sure that whether that's at a spiritual level, an economic level, a social level, whatever political involvement, engagement I'm having, is that it is having a positive, it's having a positive effect within my communities. And I do think that, like, in terms of when we go through difficult times in the world, kind of, we find ourselves in these situations, you know, I mean, this is not the first time that we've been on the edges of a global conflict. This is not the first time that there's been major social and economic upheaval. This has happened in the past before. This is a feature of human experience. The way you get through that is by having people you can count on, and not going the dark route of assuming that, like, hoarding resources or willing to resort to violence is actually going to do anything but make the problems worse. Right. And so I do think that, like, kind of what you're talking about, like, you know, in the Dakotas with the farming side of things, like, there's a remarkable amount of things I think that are possible there. And I think it's a lot of times it's just an act of imagination, right? How do we make this happen? Well, on the ground, you got a lot of flexibility. Like, what can you do and what are you willing to do? You know, and a lot of that,
right.
A lot of like our problems at a social level, to me, is like a lack of creativity, a lack of imagination. And people, you know, it's a lot easier to, like, get onto Twitter and, you know, to whine about politics. And
the system that we have set up, it actually, I know that people think that somehow the capitalist system that we have somehow causes a flourishing of imagination, but that's not true, because it only supports a flourishing of imagination in so much as people are able to imagine ideas from which someone can gain a profit. So we could have breakthrough ideas that would actually solve some of the real resource shortage problems that we have, that would never see the light of day within our system if someone can't control and profit from them, or if they would threaten the structures that are already established that are controlling and profiting from them. So there's actually a huge limitation on imagination because of that amoral system, which is effectively any system which is amoral is effectively diabolical. It really is, because if you're not morally positive, then you are diabolical. Because evil has no positive being. That's why. So, I mean, so we need to actually open up more space for that. And that's one of the reasons our system needs to change. We cannot continue to have a system where the only goal is profit and GDP growth to infinity. And Jed, your idea of erasing debt, as far as I'm concerned, I have no problem with that, because debt is debt. What is debt? Debt is how much of a false quantitative infinity that we've invented one person owes to another person.
Yeah, debt is always a legal fiction.
Or one group, right? It's totally fictional. Now, actual resources matter, but the system we've created incentivizes people to gain control of those resources and to keep them limited and finite so that they can extract profit from them. Yeah. That's going to lead to a lack of imagination, I guarantee you.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, so this is something that doesn't come out a lot in like our discussions, like within our community, but I have a business background, right? And a lot of what we have is a measurement problem. Like, right. You only get what you measure. And if all you're measuring is profitability, then all of your activity is going to be directed toward that end, right? And so every line item in your profit and loss statement or on your balance sheet is really directed toward, is directed toward that profit motive. But if you're measuring, things in terms of actual value, right? It doesn't mean you have to necessarily quantify that, but at least to have a flourishing index, a moral and ethical index, measuring those kinds of things in meaningful ways where that is a part of, what you're aiming for and the results that you're holding yourself accountable for in any kind of organizational enterprise type driven activity. You will get, it doesn't mean you're going to get it every time, but you're not going to get it if you don't measure it.
Right. That's actually was a huge part of the Yang platform, by the way. And one of his points is that it was exactly that. Like you're only going to incentivize people to pursue that which you are measuring. And right now, like GDP and shareholder profit really are the only things that we're measuring in our system. If we create new metrics, let's assume for a moment that people aren't evil. That most people aren't evil, and most people would, if they're incentivized to pursue other goods, will pursue other goods. But as long as you're not even measuring those outcomes, there's zero incentive for anybody to pursue that.
Right, like ecology does not get. I mean, we have ecology encoded at least at some regulatory level, but there's no way that we're measuring.
But there's no positive incentive.
Yeah,
it's strictly don't do this.
Yeah, don't do this or you're going to get a fine from the EPA, or, here in California, we've got like 1 million governing bodies for all kinds of different ecological codes and regulations. And sometimes it's cumbersome. But there's no real, if your motive is a profit motive and you're not necessarily regulating that ethical position, then what you're doing is if it's expedient to engage in unethical activity to hit your numbers, then there's a good chance you're going to do that because that's what you've incentivized.
Not only that, we've perversely created, because the system as established you're ultimately answerable only for your shareholder profit. You actually are morally obligated within our perverse system to pursue that profit motive.
Oh, and it gets couched in those terms. I mean, you'll see guys on like CNBC and like the big financial channels talk about kind of the virtue of their activity. And Eugene McCrare hits on that a lot of times within his book, The Enchantments of Mammon. Is it's not a disenchanted world. The capitalism has become like its own moral and spiritual force with its own imperatives and its own enchantments. But we don't question it. And so, the world that we live in, it seems like, I mean, especially, I know this from working with very wealthy people in the construction industry, where I've done like large custom homes, large properties, all kinds of stuff, is by and large, I don't run into people who are extraordinarily wealthy that they're any better or worse than just your average middle class person or somebody who's maybe in lower income brackets. But there is a sense of they are really blind to how the ways in which they benefit from the system create suffering further down the line, right? And I think part of it is like you just can't look at it, because then you have to question whether or not
Everything.
Everything, yeah.
But it's not because they're like wicked, evil people. Like, and a lot of times it's like they're actually really cool, like fun to talk with, like somebody you would want to sit down and share a meal with. I mean, sometimes you can run into some people that are rich and are unruly and unpleasant, but you can run into
Yeah,
that.
but you can run into poor people that are too.
Exactly. It's not necessarily a great indicator, but what I do notice is that, anytime you get into discussion about, well, but our system has some fundamental inequities and injustices that are folded in, it's like they can't look at that, because then they're kind of, having to defend themselves. And so I've noticed that some of it like is also it's certain strata of rich is like also helping them to understand like, oh no, you're in this together with the rest of us. We have one human community. Like, is also to be able to incentivize them to not just pursue the rational self-interest of the profit motive. Even if they're good people, what ends up happening is you're participating in systems of oppression, and once they become aware of it, they kind of go one of two ways. And I've seen people go like kind of the activist route and kind of betray their own class, or they just have to say, nah, I can't go there.
You could literally be sued by your own shareholders if you're not putting the profit motive first.
Yeah. I got to step away for just a quick second. I'll be right back though.
Nate, would you give me the bullet points, a summary of your view of Christian anarchism? Because I have not had time to watch all of your videos.
Okay, sure. So essentially, Christian anarchism holds that the state is a diabolical institution. that it doesn't actually hold any divine authority, that it would be associated with the diabolical principalities and powers. That draws inspiration from the book of Samuel, when God tells what the Israelites what will happen if they have a king. And it also comes, as I mentioned earlier, from the principles of the law of love and non-coercion. And also from the idea that as members of the kingdom of God, we're all priests and kings. So there's no right for one human being to lord it over another. There is a proper role for authority, but Christian authority is always rooted in love. And that's the source of authority. So it's the authority is all law and authority are always ultimately rooted in the divine or the sacred in every culture. And since in Christianity we have from Revelation the idea that our God is love, any claim to authority that we have, if it's rooted in God, must coincide with love and the hierarchies of love, as opposed to the hierarchies of power, which are the hierarchies of the of the diabolic hierarchies. So that's
How does,
that's the nutshell version.
yeah, how do you see church mingled into that as far as
That's great.
hierarchy, authority, etc.?
Now, this is where I differ, and that's mainly probably because of my Catholic background. I actually see the church as a legitimate authority that is divinely established. And I see the church as an alternative polis. I actually think that the church has been negligent in leading the way in terms of helping to create these kinds of parallel institutions and intermediary institutions that I'm talking about. There was a time in history when the church did more of that, when the church was building universities and hospitals and all of these Christian institutions that really created our civilization as we know it. And the church has really stepped back from that role. And even the institutions of the church, it is allowed to become corrupted by the secular influence, so that they're no longer really institutions of the church. Catholic universities and Catholic hospitals are not really Catholic in any meaningful way anymore. So
do you think the church should be influencing the state on any level, or should it just be completely?
Should I just ignore it?
Yeah. what happens when they can't? So
what was that?
What happens when it's not possible?
That will happen. I mean, you're going to be times where it can't just ignore the state because it's under a state of oppression. And then that's when Romans 12 comes right where it's talking about praying for enemies. So it's letting you know right there, the state is your enemy, right? Because immediately before Romans 13 is Romans 12, which is talking about praying for enemies. And then it's addressing a situation where you have the Christians in Rome who are under exactly that state of oppression and persecution. And it just is. So what Romans 13 is simply telling you is just to keep your head down. Just don't. It's a principle of non-participation. Just don't mix yourself up with this power of the sword.
Yeah.
That is the state.
So what happens when the hierarchies of the church become corrupt?
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. Exactly.
These are all questions that I won't get.
This is right. And Michael Martin and I have talked about that quite a bit, because he's also someone of a Catholic background who's less than thrilled about the direction of the church in recent years. And I think that you can still find laity and like-minded clergy can still cooperate together to do these things, even when the upper hierarchy of the church is not fulfilling its role.
Yeah, so that just brings it back again to the local communal level.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. There's no way out of it. And I'm not doing a whole lot right now. I have a estuary group that I lead that's held at my local church. I really am trying to build Grail Country as much as possible as a community, and to see where that leads in the future. My wife and I actually do have some ideas of at some point down the line, having an actual physical community. We'll see what happens. It's definitely, if that's what God, if God wants to see that happen, I'm sure he'll open a way for it to happen. But so yeah, it really drives a lot of what I do subtly. So
what's interesting, Nate, is I think on this one, I'm even more suspicious of ecclesial power,
right,
than you are.
Yeah, I know.
I think that, I mean, my basic reading is that since the settlement of Constantine, the church has basically bastardized its own fundamental commitments to really be an apocalyptic community. And really, we're ambassadors of a kingdom that is not yet of this world, right? When Jesus, when Jesus is questioned by Pilate about the nature of his kingdom, that's exactly what he says. My kingdom isn't of here yet, right? And so I think that what we have done is we've made this subtle compromise with those diabolical systems of power And they're not always, the diabolism of those power structures is not always easily apparent, right? Because they do function. Like we've managed over the last 2,000 years, we have a civilizational history with some structure and some order and some value that it confers on people. It's not great, but it's better than, you know, a completely disintegrated social setting, right? So there is function. And I think that the church found itself in a position where what we at times lacked and at other times have embodied is that otherworldly vision of, in a sense, we're standing in the gap and we're making space for people to enter into a new reality. And we're embodying that. Now, there was a really interesting historical example. I was listening to Tom Holland's audiobook on the origins and the rise of Islam. And he was a lot of that is happening in and around Syria, which was predominantly a Christian territory all the way up until the Muslim conquests. And one of the things he noted is that a lot of the kind of the towering monuments of antiquity in the Syrian territory were basically taken down, and they, you know, historians for a long time were very confused as to where these, you know, these antique societies went. Well, what happened was this was a Christian society, so a lot of those structures and monuments and memorials were torn down, and their you know, the material was used to build out the cities that became the Syria that we know, including places like Aleppo and other areas. Is what had happened is that the Syrian Christians did not place a huge premium on the value of wealth. And so they were much more distributive in their approach, and it led to a very flourishing society there for several hundred years in early Christianity. And so there are times where Christians have actually kind of done a good job of creating that space. But, you know, in as much as we're kind of cozied up to power and, you know, kind of think institutionally, as opposed to thinking of ourselves organically as an organism or a body. And so you measure the health of an institution in a very different way than you measure the health of a body, right? Is like, I think that we need to look at even the way we construe power and hierarchy and authority in a very different way. And I think that flows from the cross. Jesus is exercising authority from the cross. Right. And how he's doing that is in only the most ironic sort of way, is he's giving himself for and as the life of the world.
Well, just to harken back to our go ahead.
If the church takes up a posture toward the world of we exist for your life, for your benefit, for your flourishing, and that is kind of our modus operandi, that's the animating principle that moves us forward. Like, our hierarchies look a lot different. And so what I see within like church authority and power structures is just a self-referentiality. It's always reverting to itself in this kind of this self-authenticating sort of way that we never escape our own internal contradictions, because we're not really looking at that transcendental reality that is the kingdom, that is meant to be also brought into this world in a very imminent sort of way.
Yeah, it loses sight of the kingdom and just wants to perpetuate its own institutional structure forward into the future.
Right. And so tradition for the sake of tradition, or integralism for the sake of integralism, and, you know, or theonomy for the sake of theonomy. And it's like, well, what is the kingdom? Right. And I think we can even just use our own Christian sources, like like Gregory of Nyssa and his idea of that epictasis, of the ever outstretching reality that we're always growing further into, you know, further up, further in, however we talk about those terminologies. Like, there's always a future orientation, a movement toward the horizon that we need to be looking for, which to me is, you know, that's why I like the thinking of Jedidiah so much, is he understands the kingdom as the creative call of the Christian community.
Well, the natural direction to look for for authority until Christ returns is toward saints. So I don't know if there's a political term for rule by saints, but really that's who genuinely has authority. Like, that's who we should be following. Mm-hmm. In as much as we're able to discern people's holiness, like, we should be following holy people, mm-hmm. and to take their lead.
Yep. No, I totally agree with that. And I think that's the realization you know, my husband and I have come to a lot lately is you see people pointing fingers out there for, you know, that person or this person to fix what's going on. And yet if we're not looking at that in our own hearts, it doesn't even matter. Like
Right.
nothing is going to change.
Right. Yeah, it's like, I mean, each Christian is an individual instance of the kingdom. So
Right.
and if we taking that seriously, there's no way that we get to make excuses or push off responsibility. We have to live from that place as much as possible and extend that within our sphere of influence as much as we are able to. And that's gonna vary from person to person, depending on, what what their resources are, what abilities they have, et cetera. But there's definitely no evading that responsibility. And in terms of like the church, it's like I can't help but think about I was just actually recently reread Solovyov's Tale of the Antichrist. And toward the end of that, like he has three figures in that book, or in that, it's a short story really. It's not very long. He has one figure that represents orthodoxy named Elder John, and then he has a figure that represents Protestantism named Dr. Pauli, who's like a German theologian, and then he has the Pope, who's Pope Peter. He's like this, so like the second Peter, right? And the church in his short story, most of the churchmen who are gathered before this Antichrist figure, the coming man who has like established himself, most of them go to his side. And it's only like a tiny handful that follows the lead of those three persons that I just mentioned, who actually resist him. So I mean, there's Solovyev as an Orthodox writer, but you can see here that that's what his real conception of the church is. It's like those who stand for the kingdom.
Yeah. And I think that that's the real threat, like within our Christian communities in our society today, is you get like in Revelation you have two beasts. You have a political one and a religious one, right? Who are kind of working in tandem. You have a false trinity in the book of Revelation. You have the two beasts under the control of Satan, the archon of this world. And then you have the real, Father, Son, Spirit. And so you have this kind of Trinitarian war that it's depicting. But what I think, and I think that's playing itself out over not just like some end time thing, but that is realistically, that's the struggle throughout history. And that is overcome at the cross, and by bearing witness to what is happening at the cross and bringing that into the reality in the way we live our lives. However, I think that the real threat, and this has always been the real threat within Christianity, is that we acquiesce to the power of a self-referential religion, whatever it is, and acquiesce to the powers of the state. Mm-hmm. And I think that has manifested itself historically in incredible levels of violence that has been committed by Christians who are willing to kind of work as that enforcing arm of state and religious power. And I think that we are running into some of that in the world we live in today. It's really a dangerous situation. And I think that becomes the urgent call to us, is like, we aren't called to participate in that. We're called to actually oppose those dual principles and show a different way. And no
matter what the Patriarch of Moscow says.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to, I'll reserve my comments on that for maybe another time, but
save them for our Dugan discussion that's coming up.
One way or the other, but here in Christian America, I mean, kind of some of the violent rhetoric behind American patriotism.
Yeah, right. We're no better.
It's like, these are problematic because we're participating in systems of violence and control, and that is not what Jesus has called us to. And so it's like, I don't care if you're liberal or progressive or wherever you land on the spectrum, like, we're called to something very different. And I think that there's healthy iterations of that along the whole
So a
spectrum.
healthy community actually needs both progressive and conservative elements.
Oh, for
But
sure.
and that goes beyond politics, because that progressivism and conservatism are actually, they're orientations of the soul. They're not really simply political. Like you have people that you have people that are naturally more oriented toward protecting the established order, and then you have people that are more naturally oriented toward discovering the new
Mhm.
and
My
advancing the
my
community.
husband and I are on opposite ends of that spectrum. So
Right. Yeah. And you need, that's good though.
no,
You
it is.
actually need a
very good.
healthy communication between both kinds of persons to have a healthy community,
Yep.
regardless of how that's organized politically or even whether it's a political organization. So that there will always be a need for that. You need both elements. You absolutely do.
Yeah.
And the churches, it seems like, especially, I mean, I haven't had a lot of experience outside of Midwestern Bible Belt Christianity, but they tend to group by political affiliation.
Yeah.
And
That's
then,
not good.
no, it's not.
We need to reverse that trend. We really do.
Yeah, but church we've actually been attending lately, and we're going to be joining. There is actually a wide spectrum of political diversity in the church, and my husband and I both really appreciated that, because while we have our views, we want to be pushed and challenged, and it's actually led to some really good things. And there seems to be this level of unity that can occur beyond the political if you actually let it, and that's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that was actually kind of one of the great gifts of my trip to Iowa was me discovering, like, in this very conservative reformed part of Iowa, it's all basically everybody is part of either the CRC, or which is Paul Vanderklay's denomination, or I think it was the RCA, I think is the other one, but they're all Christian Reform, and they're all Dutch. Like almost everyone, it's a very Dutch and Reformed community, and it's very conservative. It's like the most Republican voting district in all of the state of Iowa. And that's where I got sent to campaign for Yang. But I had these wonderful conversations with people who like had very different politics from me, where we discovered like all kinds of like common values and common aspirations and shared faith and all these kinds of different overlap. And it was a wonderful experience. And more people need to be doing that, and then certainly the churches should be a place that reflects that, because as I said, you really need the progressive and conservative elements in constructive dialogue with one another in order to have a healthy community, and that applies to church community as much as any other kind of community.
Well, it's like, and it's, I think even like in like our own community, Nate, with like the friends on Voxer here at Grail Country, I mean, you and I are probably closer aligned.
Yeah, we're the most progressive.
But it's like, I mean, and I know my role within basically any community I am is that there's not an envelope that exists that I'm not going to try to push right to the ragged edge of. I want to find the limit.
But that's your job as a progressive personality.
Yeah, and it's like
that's your role.
And
you're supposed to do that.
And I come out of a very conservative background, but just temperamentally, that's just not my wiring. It's just not. There's not a conservative instinct in my body, and once I realized, like, it's just not the way I am. But what I do like about, especially like conscientious conservatives, is I appreciate when I hit the yeah, but question. Yeah, Jed, but what about this? Or what about that? Because a lot of times I'm so out in future orientation of where is this thing going that I don't even think about where are we taking it and how are we going to get there. And those questions are really important. And so,
and as a progressive personality, you're not good at spotting unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I understand, like, there's certain things that I'm just not going to see.
Right.
You know? And I don't feel the need to necessarily see all of those things, because I have communities of people and friends that are more in that conservative framework that are going to ask the right questions. I'm not even good at asking those questions. I won't see them. You know.
Right. And that's where the deep friendships and community with people of differing personality types and views is so important, because I'm not going to be influenced to change my mind by someone sending me a YouTube video where this guy explains XYZ. It's going to be in those relationships where I actually know the person and I trust them. And that's where my husband and I tend towards that progressive pushing, asking questions, tearing things apart. But I can't do that without affecting my relationship with him and our whole family. So it has the consequence of making us figure out where the balance is, which is very difficult.
Yeah, it is. It's the best
actually
situation you can have.
Yeah, it is fun. It's actually a joy when you can battle in a productive way, and change each other's minds. Like if you're actually open to listening and hearing, then my mind has been changed.
My mind has changed all the time.
I'm always right. I no, I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't even think in that category. It's like, are you right? Well, I don't know.
I mean, I challenge my Christian anarchism all the time. I'm always engaging with the best thought I can find on the Christian right. And being always, because if I'm wrong, I want to know about it.
Right. Well, and I think that's where the promise for, like, even in, like, as we've been talking, as I'm thinking about some of the things that we're saying here, is once again, like when we're looking at, we haven't really even hit on theonomy and those bigger questions yet. Maybe we don't. That's cool. That's totally fine. But it's like, whatever we make of our social and political arrangements, if we're not taking into account like the real person and what a human being is in that, and it can engage at a personal level, then we're almost invariably going to go wrong, right? Well, it doesn't fit within this system. Well, you got like capitalism is such a depersonalizing system, right? And it's like, well, we don't have to have that arrangement. That's just something we're all kind of collectively at this point just sort of defaulting to and agreeing to. We don't have to have that. We could think of a different system. Maybe the Jubilee ideas that I have are on the right track. Maybe they're not. But like, if we can have those kind of conversations at the personal level where you're able to deal with people as real people, I think that allows us to have kind of more consensus and buy-in, because people feel heard and listened to and valued and engaged. And I think that's part of why, like my sense of like my own political involvement, the reason why I'm not as engaged on the political front these days is because I don't feel like
none of it is good. What is there to really endorse?
Yeah, it's just like, I don't feel like I can contribute value there.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so it's like, well, I want to go to where I feel like I can contribute real value, and I just can't do it in those structures at this point.
Just to bring it back to the theonomy question, since you reference it really quickly, I would actually be willing to give an unqualified yes to the concept of theonomy. But here's the thing. We only discover what God's law is through dialogue with one another in communities of love. Mm-hmm. No one has absolute knowledge of that.
Right. No one individual.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and you can run into so this is my fundamental critique of any kind of theonomy or Catholic integralism, or kind of the rising certain factions of imperialism within Orthodox thought, is almost in every instance, I feel like what they have done is taking a good thing, which is law, morality, social norms, those kinds of things, and have idolized them. Mm-hmm. Right? Those are all meant to serve us, not the other way around. And so I think that what it doesn't allow for is a certain, I'm not saying everything is, there's no such thing as absolutes or anything like that, but there's a relativity to a lot of these things that requires relationships with people from different perspectives and different backgrounds. And so, if you're looking at the law through the lens of love, then yeah, you can begin to say, well, how do these biblical norms, how do they filter into a society? But then we have to remember, we don't live in a strictly Christian society or a strictly Christian world. And so if your animating concern is love first, then when you're getting into questions of law and order, like if love is the impelling force behind that, I think that you're going to run a much higher chance of not getting into a place where you get into like those oppressive kind of draconian communities. And I've seen it. Like,
well, there's a tendency in those systems of thought to like elevate essentially the pagan idea of the noble soul. But that's ultimately breaks down to the will of power. The will to power, it really does. It's not like and the leaders that end up getting admired in these circles are people who exhibit characteristics of the Ubermensch and not the saint.
Yeah, and
they end up following and glorifying exactly the wrong things. And even when they're being put forward by people who are ostensibly deeply Christian.
Well, and I being kind of in the Reformed and Presbyterian world for 10, 15 years, there's diversity there. So the kind of the school of thought within Reformed Christianity that I bought into is more of like called the spirituality of the church in two kingdoms. You have the kingdom of the world and you have the kingdom of God, and they need to remain separate. So there's kind of even the ideas of separation in church and state kind of flow from certain elements of Reformed political thought, right? But then you also have this very real theocratic element in Reformed thought that they kind of go in one of two different directions. I went in this direction, the theonomists are kind of over here. And what I noticed in those communities, and I noticed those tendencies even in some of the conservative evangelical churches that I was raised in, is like it is almost this fortress mentality against the world of like, we are protecting ourselves from the world and we're going to kind of have these isolated alternative societies. But then when you get inside of those communities, they're facing the same kind of problems that we have anywhere else in the world. And so they're not really actually that isolated from it. It's like they will decry the world for their sexual ethics. So you peel back the curtain of what's going on in their communities, and it's not pretty, and so, or they'll peel back problems of, corruption and financial and malfeasance. But I've seen things that are shocking at that level in some of those communities. So it's like the law itself has no ability to bring about the flourishing life. It's just telling you where the flourishing is, right? A different principle has to animate that, and it is love. And I think that, like, for a certain conservative mindset, that might drive them crazy and make me sound like a hippie or something like that, which I'm fine with. I love the hippies.
Oh, I'm a total hippie.
But it's like, no, I actually think that, in a sense, like, as someone who has lived in and grown up in conservative communities, like, no, I actually think that there is a pragmatism to love. It actually works better, right? It actually makes community life livable or family life livable. And if it's all about law, if there isn't kind of the law grace dialectic that we have in like Reformed thinking, like, if you're not able to bring grace to bear in your communities, they cease to function very well. And I think that, like, in terms of flourishing, it's like, well, a lot of times it's kind of, to me, it's like this quixotic quest to recreate some idealized version of the past that never did exist.
I think, well, it's very important. I would agree with everything you said there, but we have to understand what we mean by love.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
and that's what I think. That's where I think that where conservative types get nervous is that they're going to be suspicious of what you mean by love. Right?
Woodstock, man.
Right. You don't, though. I mean, that's not. You don't mean what the Beatles meant or what Woodstock meant or the idea of free love. That's not what you're talking about at all.
Because there would be people who would say it's not loving to allow people to continue in their sin.
Right.
It's the loving thing to do is to bring correction and bring guidance.
Yeah, accountability is part of love. Like, there's no, like, yeah. If you're, like, in a situation where you have natural authority, within a properly ordered hierarchy of love, say as a parent, right? You have natural authority over your child, but that is but the way you exercise that properly is from within the proper orientation within that hierarchy of love. But there's an accountability there. There's nothing loving about just like, letting your child do whatever they want.
Yeah. Yeah. That usually doesn't work out very well.
Right.
Yeah. I think that like in that sense of like, you just a lot of times, like I understand like the fear of like allowing love to animate our vision, our social, political, and economic vision. I understand, like, yeah, are we going to end up with Woodstock kind of thing? Are we going to end up in this kind of this free love, amorphous kind of anything goes sort of thing? And I think that like I understand the concern, but at the same time, it's not as if like even within conservative communities that there's like such a level of biblical illiteracy that they can't come up with a cogent definition of love. You know what I mean? They know, we all know kind of in a sense what
well, but they're a little bit, the reason they're guarded though is that progressive types will kind of be will play a little bit of a weasel word game with that when it suits their interests. And that's what makes them guarded about it.
Yeah, and I think that like that's where you can, that's where the personalism comes in, is
right.
Deal with that at a personal level, like as somebody who comes from a more of a conservative perspective can say, well, hey, this concerns me, here's why. What do you think about this? Versus like well, that's not going to work, or you're way out in left field and clearly trying to
it's not going to work for anyone if there's no dialogue, which is why I said that before. Like, I think for us in our culture, I think like the best possible situation for us looks something like traditional English village governance, where you have like a messy, village council that gets together and they argue back and forth and they have dialogue and they figure out as a community what the best thing to do is, and everyone agrees to abide by those decisions.
And rarely anything ever gets done. Like
right.
Yes. Yeah, right. No.
Right, exactly.
Good.
Right, yes.
Right. Say what you will about, America and capitalism, et cetera, but we actually are set up by living in this society to almost be able to create something like that because the opportunities that we have. So that is an interesting.
It's deeply, deeply within our cultural identity, as part of the, the broader, descendants of the medieval English culture.
Yeah.
I mean, it's deeply embedded within us. It actually is like, it's actually pre-Christian. It's so deeply embedded in us. I mean, that's how pagan Anglo-Saxons were governing themselves too.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes way, way back. So, yeah.
I mean, we're even going so far as to, there's an abandoned little, I don't know what it was, Methodist church down the road within walking distance. And we're like, we could probably buy that building, fix it up. And, I mean, centering in the medieval village type way, centering the church within the community.
Right.
And, it seems a bit idealistic, I think, but who cares?
Right. No, it's good to have dreams like that. I mean, it's good. Why would you not? I mean, think we should be dreaming beautiful dreams and trying to implement them as much as possible. And if God creates a way for us to make them happen, then we should make them happen.
Well,
I know Sherry at one point was like sharing pictures of a medieval village in Switzerland that was actually for sale.
Nice.
It's beautiful too.
I think that people are hungry for that because, like, in reality, like what has been replaced with sacred space in our society are strip malls, movie theaters, and centers for entertainment. And I forget what his name was. Neil Postman wrote that book way back in the day, Amusing Ourselves to Death or something like that. Is like, in our society, like, we place such a high premium on entertainment that, in a sense, like, our priestly caste are, actors and content producers and that kind of thing. that it can convey a sense of the sacred. I mean, sometimes you can go to a movie and be truly moved and have a really interesting vision of reality. However, it's not a replacement for real sacred space, you
Right.
know.
Well, look at the difference between, say, a concert and like a community music space. Those are total. There's so much more. There's so much more going on in a community music space where you have lots of people participating and playing instruments or singing or dancing or whatever, and like everyone's participating together versus like, you know, the concert environment where you just have like the performer and the audience. It's so flattened and
Well,
so much less rich.
replicates that,
What was
right?
that?
So much of church, it falls in that performer.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
kind of
Right.
paradigm, like
Yeah,
you-
church should look more like that, you know, that community space where people get together and gather and play music.
even like in the old churches where, you know, oftentimes the choir lofts would be surrounding the whole congregation. Like it wasn't like they were a part of and embedded within like the worshiping community. There was a sense that it was a community project, not something I'm watching in front of me
Right.
by the guy who's got the lights and the mic.
Yeah, that's particularly a problem in Protestantism where really it looks like a performance
Yeah. And
more
I
than
mean,
anything else. And the emphasis is on the performance rather than the community liturgical practice.
yeah, and to the degree that it's like our cultural idiom, I mean, Christianity has always kind of folded in cultural idioms and kind of renovated them. Like I'm sure there are ways to have a church that has that kind of contemporary type of a feel, that uses those modern forms, but in a far more participatory manner that isn't as performative. Right?
Yeah, right.
But I mean, it's, you know, yeah, it lends itself, like, you know, because of how closely tied, like, especially certain iterations of Protestantism are with capitalist society. Of course, we're going to look a lot like the culture.
Sometimes you can see this still in some smaller churches. Like I know there was a when my son was little, um I had started going back to Pentecostal church. So I was back in the Pentecostal church when my son was very young. And we were attending this little Pentecostal church where there's a very small church, so like less than 50 people probably in the church. And, you know, my son was able to like get up onto the platform and like play the tambourine and just like groove out while, you know, while the music was being played in the church. And like the music was like mostly like old time Southern gospel. And I love that actually. I have fond memories of that church because of that. So
yeah, the church we're attending it's an OCA Orthodox church, but it's fairly small. And it's one of the churches without any pews or chairs. So
Right.
everyone is standing, and it's very much encouraged to have all the kids in. And there's quite a few young children. And so there might be a screaming baby or a toddler that just like runs across the, you know, the church during the middle of liturgy or whatever. But someone will just run in and scoop them up and bring them back. And you know, you can hear each other's voices, and the choir is off to the side. And so there's a lot of that in what we're experiencing in that.
yeah,
church.
that I remember the first time I attended mass in a Catholic church, I was like just like shocked by like how many like children were there, and they were like, you know, doing things that children do, and like no one seemed to care or notice. Because coming out of like Protestant world in my upbringing, it's like, you know, most Protestant churches have nurseries,
Oh, yeah.
and there's separate Sunday school for the kids. And you don't see the kids. So it's a very different atmosphere.
Yeah, well, I mean, then you get like youth group culture and
Right.
all.
Right. Yeah.
That could be a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if either of you have any like closing thoughts, but I think I've pretty much said everything that I needed to say.
This has been fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too.
I appreciate your
Thank you for inspiring us to do this, Sarah. We appreciate it. So,
anytime.
all right.
We'll do it again.
I'll probably post this in a couple of days. I'll let you guys know.
Okay.
All
Sounds
right. All right.
Much.
Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.
Take care.
Bye. Yep.
Bye.